Here we are again, and this is our ninth session. Uh, our helpers today are, I'm going to ask the camera behind me to let you see Czech to my left. She's going to help us, and Song on my right. I must admit those sound a little strange, or maybe to you, those names, but they sometimes like to use names that mean something to them from the discipline that they've been working on, and I think that Czech probably was so taken with the Czech partner relationship and how we've said it's so valuable, how T and I in early days said it's so valuable to always have a Czech for everything that we do. And so she chose to identify with that name, and we do use it at times. And I think that Song likes the idea that this whole information is like the song of truth, the song of our Heavenly Father. And it certainly is. Well, in an earlier session, I explained to you that I believe that I did, that we got up early in the morning, and while everyone happened to be in the same place because we had a holiday, and we were visiting, and we had a little lesson about the, I don't need to get into the lesson because we went over it with you at that time. But here's another little illustration that I want to share with you. In the quarters where I spent last evening or last night, I seemed to sleep only a very short time, and not that that's that unusual. I don't seem to require that much sleep, and that's fine. But from about 1:30 on, it was as if I wanted to stay in communication with T and wanted to see if there's anything that we needed to alter or anything that I needed to particularly be aware of that I was not aware of in our sessions. And one point that came in so clearly that was new to me in a sense because we hadn't discussed it in the sessions was that really these sessions are for this classroom. In other words, it's for the students. These sessions, I feel that I have instruction, that T is helping me, hopefully speaking through me, and so on up the pipeline. But that it's almost as if I have instructions to make these tapes for these sessions for the purposes that the students will have use of if this task continues. And so it puts the focus in a little different point because it's up to them. They don't have clear-cut instructions on what to do with these tapes or these sessions. And we don't make them up. We do a step at a time. I think I've mentioned to you before that very often instructions just come a step at a time, and then we wait for the next one. But we do whatever we have received. And we did receive instructions to try this method of operation here to see if it would work for the teacher to make tapes with the students, trying to help with the picture and asking some questions. And it seemed that my older member was coming in to those sessions and helping us with information, and it was working. We seemed to be being used as instruments for their information, and as soon as it seemed to flow as well as it did, even though we know that could change at any time, then we've just been going on with it. It's been hard to stop. We've almost wanted to not miss a day without doing a session or two, as long as we felt like we were still getting information to go further. But I want to make the point a little bit more clearly that these sessions and these tapes are, in a sense, teaching tools for the students. To get that idea a little more clearly in our heads, in other words, my relationship, we'll speak of this in a sense, it's symbolic, in a sense it isn't, but my relationship with you, if this task proceeds, might end up being more as grandfather to grandson, and they might more serve in the capacity since they are older than you. I don't know if that has clarified in your mind, but if it might have, if other things that we have said have added up at this time. If they have completed sufficient overcoming of their own in this task, and they received instruction to put the information out, even though the way that instruction came was to do it in this method, then they are, in a real sense, going to serve in the teacher role with you, or in a sense, in the midwifing or the father relationship, if you don't use that in a spiritual term. But in other words, if they have completed enough overcoming that they could move right now into our Father's kingdom, and even move into a physical vehicle of our Father's kingdom, out and no longer occupying the vehicle they're in, whether this one or the one that they're in is changed over into that one or another one. In other words, they don't need to come back to the human kingdom unless sent. That's the instruction we have received, that's the case. So here's another one of those days where you're put to the test by things that we say, because this could be hard to make a mental adjustment to. Each time we arrive at a threshold of a major move forward, it always tests us. And it usually tests us, I'm not sure I can buy that. But if you examine things and the next thing you know, you say, well, it makes sense. It certainly, I'll just have to see. I'll just have to play it a step at a time, and that's the way you should, just simply a step at a time. And checking, just as we check, and you check with your Heavenly Father, you check with your connection and see if we have the same one. If we don't have the same connection, then that's a clear indication that it's time for you to cease in this process of letting us serve as the instruments to help you get this picture and get this information that we have instruction to share with you. Well, we're going to proceed with our questions, and I'm going to ask Czech first. What's first on her list of questions?
Well, I just wanted to see if you felt like if we wanted to say more about the terms God, Lord, and older member.
Yes, I feel that we should. That's a very misunderstood issue. Humans have a lot of misunderstandings about the term God, so much so that some, without really stopping and thinking about the implications of it, they think, well, there's only one God, and everything in the heavens is God, so there must be only one creature there, and yet they also think that people, when they die, go there, so how can there only be, well, it gets kind of confusing. And the term God, that the English term God, unfortunately in the translation from the manuscripts of the Bible, there were different terms used, and the English translators kind of lumped them all into one and used God, no matter which Hebrew name was used, that really meant a member of the kingdom of heaven that was assigned a particular relating task to the humans. And so if we look at manuscripts and see the different names that were applied, some think, well, that's talking about the different characteristics of this one person. And they don't stop to think that the Chief of Chiefs, or the God of gods, the Almighty, the Most High God, the Creator in the kingdom of heaven, can assign his membership, or some from his membership, to assist him in tending to the garden, certainly in elementary tasks, or tasks that would be elementary to the Creator. And that doesn't mean that they have not even learned how to create in a garden circumstance. But as the different individuals, for sake of clarity and understanding, it would help your head, as it has helped us, to understand that, as it has been given to us, that the different members of the kingdom of heaven that were assigned to relate to the humans in this age. Depending upon the task that was their assignment, they ended up with a different title, and it was more of a title than it was a name. If you know much about the history in Hebrew as it relates to the name that applies to members of our Father's kingdom, there is some discussion that those names were never to be pronounced and never to be spoken. Some even don't even write them except maybe write a consonant to start it, and then a dash and maybe another consonant to end it. There's been all kinds of theological discussion through the years about the taboo-ness of humans being able to call the names or not to really know the names. So the humans have titles that they are given to use to illustrate. And like I say, those titles were reduced to just a single title in the translation to English. So the title God is just kind of like a general over title, where there were others that were broken up depending upon the task that the member who was assigned by the Creator, or whichever subordinate member assigned that individual to work directly with the humans, whether it be Adam and Eve in the garden or those in the desert or in Egypt or in Israel. So don't be confused by these terms. These are simply titles. Now, those titles should have tremendous respect from the humans, because in a sense it is a human relating to a member of the kingdom of heaven, and they wouldn't be relating to them if the information was worthless, or if they were simply humans just relating to them in human matters. They're relating to them, trying to help them get mindful of the truth, the reality that the kingdom of heaven exists, and that they were made, that they're plants that were made by the kingdom of heaven. And if they follow the instruction and behavior from the kingdom of heaven, then they can learn to actually aspire to be members of the kingdom of heaven. But just to get those titles straight, now Jesus, in his relationship with his disciples, some of them called him Lord and called him Rabbi, or called him Teacher, or called him Jesus. And from our point of view, I believe that probably from their reference point, that teacher was the most applicable term, and that Lord probably meant more in its original meaning as reference to a member of our Father's kingdom, or someone who is above you in the step of growth, the step of elevation or closer to God. Even in kingdoms of humans' kingdoms, where they have a monarchy, or they have a king or a queen, and they use the term lords for people in a position of authority and that have higher tasks in the structure of that kingdom government. And when in the Bible they use the terms kingdom, it's because the illustration of a king and a relationship of the subjects to the king and the hierarchy of authority in the kingdom of heaven is very like, or the illustration works, the analogy works. It's very like some of the structures that have been translated into the human kingdom, as they had king and queen and subjects and lords and parliament houses and so forth. And we'll discuss a little bit more of that issue the further we go. Now, a very objective term that we have been given to try to understand it, that as far as I know, I don't know of a synonym in the translation of the Hebrew. Well, I take that back. There are synonyms, both in the Hebrew and the Greek, that relate to someone who has gone further on the ladder in getting closer to the Chief of Chiefs, or closer to our Father's kingdom, as older. And also, if they're members of our Father's kingdom, then we can put those together, and they're an older member. And we talk constantly about older members in relating as a point of reference from one member to another one, a younger member, an older member. And the same, because that's perfectly synonymous with son, father, grandfather. Younger member, older member. Older member is older member. And the same way in the kingdom of heaven, as a kingdom with a king and subjects, the there is the subjects have a structure that could also be referred to in an analogy of families. Like in a partnership, there can be, if you use it in the right term, in the partnership, there can be like a husband and wife or a marriage, because there's a committal, not husband and wife, male, female, but marriage for committal in a partnership where there may not usually be that much age difference, or it might be the connecting age difference. So these are kind of used interchangeably, where even these students, for example, see me as an older member. I see them as younger members, and also a sense in the sense that they are committed to the kingdom of heaven, and have to also accept the representative in that committal. They have only one representative. They don't have much choice. At least for the moment, we haven't found much choice to give them. So in a sense, they have that same committal they make to the kingdom of heaven, to the representative that was given, and that not only they are younger members to older members, but that committal almost becomes like a marriage, if you can take it out of the male-female relationship. So it's very interesting to think of those terms, because historically in the manuscripts, as it relates to our Father's kingdom, to the humans, certainly in this age that we know about, we don't know much about the other ages, these synonyms work, even though through the ages they become kind of Old English or kind of religiousized, or we make them something less than objective, less than true, by making them very spiritual terms. And that's the reason that our instruction has been that teacher is certainly a good and appropriate term. Older member is certainly a good objective term. We can use that better. We get uncomfortable when they use the term father. Certainly if in speaking to me, even though I'm serving in that capacity, but they don't use that term in relating to me, because it gives me the jitters, because it kind of brings in the religiosity of that possible terminology, even though ever since we've begun these sessions, we're talking to you about our Heavenly Father. And even though I realize that T is my older member, in a sense synonymous with a father to me, since it's older member, and in a realistic sense, these are my children, because I have been, remember how you get birth into the kingdom of heaven? Babies come from adults from the, so if these are babies that have come from the human kingdom, entering the kingdom of heaven, and I am assigned a role of midwifing, then these are my children, I am their father. But I still get uncomfortable with the, and we don't use the term relating to me as Father, certainly not Lord, certainly not God, certainly not Heavenly Father. We reserve that kind of terminology for those who are outside of human vehicles and in vehicles that would be the natural vehicle for our Father's kingdom. Okay, let's go to the was there more to that question, Jack?
Well, I might be wrong, but it seemed like you covered it.
Okay. Song, what's next on our list?
Well, talking about terms, there's lots of interpretations to the word sin. And I'm wondering if you could help us by giving us the real meaning of sin, and if there's any validity to karma.
Okay, you put me on the spot when you said, will you give it the real meaning of the word sin? I'll do the best that I can and hope that it's T that is feeding me because I certainly trust the position that T happens to be in right now in her relationship with our older member. Sin. Sin, there, karma certainly is in this picture. Karma meaning a term that a lot of Eastern religions use, and we'll discuss that in a moment. But let's talk about sin. Sin is anything, any behavior, any act meaning a thought, any conduct, anything that I do that puts space between me and God, or between me and the kingdom of heaven, between me and the representative, between me and goodness. Anytime that the part of the mind that's in my soul gets its way, and it's not of that majority side that is mind that has been given to me from our Father's kingdom, then it is sin. It is information that came from the wrong side of the tracks, that is not true. It is misinformation. It is designed to convert me to the ways of the world, or to get me in opposition to my Father's kingdom, and to prevent me from overcoming the world and getting to my Father's kingdom. That is sin. Now, we can't talk about sin without talking about death, because I'm sure all of you know the little scriptures of the wages of sin are death. Now, we've talked about how death doesn't mean losing a vehicle. Death means losing the soul. So if my soul shrinks and deteriorates and goes further and further and further away from the kingdom of heaven by each act of sin, or each act of the world, each act of misinformation that I do, then I'm getting closer and closer to death, because death is when that mind of God that was in my soul has shrunk so that our Father's kingdom would judge it non-redeemable. Non-redeemable. It can't be reversed. It's gone by its own choices. It has gone to the point of being non-existent. There's not enough good stuff in there to even make it register. Now, let's be sure that we understand that certainly in the position and the task that we're involved in, we don't do any judging. And who would be in a position like that? But it's very important that you as a possible student understand how behavior adds up. Now, before we go any further with that, let's skip to this Eastern idea of karma, and the idea that I have to pay for, and it's not just the Eastern idea of karma. The truth as it relates to us in the manuscripts is that we pay for our sin. And the wages of sin are death. So if I continue in the path of sin, I'm going to lose my soul. I'm going to reach death. Now, in a sense, each act of sin that I do, it's going to take hard work and labor to recover from. I mean, if I become an alcoholic, it becomes labor to rise above, really rise above alcoholism. And that's just using that as an example of anything that I would overcome in the process of getting out of the sin that I got into. Now, theoretically, I could have been in an incarnate. I don't get my sin wiped clean just because I lose a vehicle and am replanted or transplanted back into the family that I was tied to with a new leaf or a new vehicle. I don't lose that. I'm still, what's the little saying that says that whatever you're bound to on earth, you're bound to in heaven? Now, that was using the term heaven to kind of throw several things into one grouping, one terminology, just like God is a general term that means a number of different things. Heaven means also a bunch of different things to different people. And like heaven was used and is used as a term of where you go when you lose your vehicle. And that may or may not be so, certainly from someone else's point of view. But many people use that term, applying that's where of course, a lot of people who use that term, heaven is where you go when you lose your vehicle, they also use another term and say if you don't go there, then you go to hell. And hell, of course, means also different things to different understandings, depending upon how much misinformation you have, or how much knowledge you have, or how closer your information is to the truth, how you've grown on the ladder of getting closer to our Father's kingdom, because that's where that truth comes in a little bit at a time. Okay, heaven and hell, and what happens in between. Song, give me that again, because my picture I got off the track, and I want to get right back on the particular of where we were. Was that yours, or was that?
Yes.
Okay.
I asked, what about sin, and does it karma have
Okay,
any validity?
let's get back to the karma idea. Thank you. Because the idea of karma is that I pay for any misdeed I have. In other words, some of the Eastern religions who believe in the idea of karma believe that if I kill somebody, then I'm going to be killed. That same thing is going to come back to me. If I murder somebody, I'm going to be murdered. If I treat somebody ill, I'm going to be treated in the same way. And that's a very close translation. Don't forget, a counterfeit is always very close to the truth. Karma is a counterfeit. Some of what it says is true. Other aspects that it says is not true. In our Father's kingdom, where it becomes untrue is that in our Father's kingdom, our Father can send a representative to accelerate your possibilities of getting closer to the kingdom of heaven. And that representative, or that individual from that kingdom, when they involve themselves in your task of overcoming and they assist you in that, they can, from an Eastern point of view, or the karma point of view, they can take your karma. Now, from our Father's house interpretation of that same idea, it's I can take your sin. I can relieve you of your sin. When Jesus said to his disciples that if you truly ask forgiveness, then I'll take it out. I'll take your case to my Father. I'll represent you to my Father. I'll see what my Father says. And if my Father says it's okay, you were truly sorry that you did it, and you want a fresh start, and you want to start over again, then who am I to say? Because I'll certainly give you that chance to start over again. And in a sense, then you would not pay for the sin that you did if you have someone who can take that from you. Now, it has to be a representative of our Father's kingdom, as Jesus was, who can take that from you and take it on themselves. In other words, it was a debt that you had. You did a bunch of wrongs, and they add up. The total keeps, every time you do behavior against our Father's kingdom, it starts totaling up on a column. And the column can get pretty big. It can get pretty terrible. And if you had to pay them off, I don't know how many ages it would take for you to get them all paid off. But this is also where time shortened comes in, and where, as our Father's kingdom relates to some who are overcoming the world, that debt gets relieved, or it gets dismissed. But not altogether, according to the rules that existed in a number of stages of this particular earth age. Now, what I mean, it didn't get relieved altogether. And here's where Christians traditionally, theologically, interpret that Jesus paid it all for you. And by his blood were ye redeemed. Now, in a lot of sense of the word, that's absolutely true, and we'll talk about that for a moment, because he said to his disciples, who were actually physically, personally relating to him, and as they did things that were against his instruction and their overcoming, and they recognized it, they acknowledged it, they asked forgiveness for it, and he said, I'll take it. And he took it. Now, he then, by taking that debt, he's got a bunch of notes he's holding here. They were your notes, and now they're his notes. And for a long time, and I'm not saying it still isn't the case, we don't know, we'll talk about this in a second, but for a long time in our Father's kingdom, the process was, or decision from the Parliament in the kingdom, we'll say, or from the Supreme Court in our Father's kingdom, said that those notes have to be paid. Somebody's got to pay those notes of sin. So if I've committed a bunch of sin and somebody takes my note and relieves me of it and washes me clean and gives me a fresh start, then that somebody who took those notes has to pay for that. And if my total sin certainly amounted to, had I not had someone to dump it on, I would have died. I would have lost my soul. And that was the case. Had those souls that Jesus was dealing with, had they not known him, now they got some help in being directed to him, but then it also required work of them to pursue him, to believe him, to fight off the influences and the doubt that the world gave them. It would have been a lot easier for them to say, well, it's getting too hot around here. People are hunting for him, and they're going to be hunting for me soon. I think I'm going to go back and play it safe. And I mean, it would have been real easy for them to stop in their process, because they could have easily said, well, I just can't believe that he's who he really says he is. We don't have any evidence of this. I mean, that happened. He lost them. He lost many who were in line for entering our Father's kingdom as sheep of his fold, or as students of him as a teacher. Now, if we'll go back to where we were, if death is the wages of sin, and these who came to him, they brought their tally to him, he took their pink slips or their notes of indebtedness, and then he had to pay for it in death. Now, and he did. You heard me in an earlier tape saying, and I hope that you paid close attention, because when I said that whether or not he died on the cross, literally diagnosed by a doctor, had there been an advanced doctor present, and rose from the dead, to base your belief on knowledge from our Father's kingdom on that one act, and say that if it wasn't so, then it's all a farce. And we said, we said that's ridiculous. We also said that it didn't matter to us whether that act was staged symbolically or whether it was real. And it didn't. But here's another possibility, that the act could have been very real had the law still been on the books in the Supreme Court as it was handed down, that those debts had to be paid. And if their debts equaled death, then it could also mean that since Jesus took them on, the only way he could pay them is to go through having the sinners, those who are adding up their own tally of the same sins, be those who then initiate that death. In other words, they are then used to pay the debt for those that were students, those who gave their debt to him, and where he wiped them clean. And he was willing to do that. Now, our Father's kingdom is alive and well, and Parliament is still in session. It has not ended. It still makes decisions, and it still relates to the Chief of Chiefs. The kingdom exists. The king is still on his throne. The whole thing works. As to whether or not that same parallel would have to be drawn today if a representative took those sins or those notes of owed debt of sin, whether they would tally death, we don't know. Or whether the law has come down in specific cases, because it's always a specific case. And it's not prejudged in that respect. Well, it is prejudged unless it has been changed. But anytime that something tests it, then you go and check the books and you see if that's still what's on the books. And if it's what's on the books, then that's what happens. We don't know what's on the books today. We don't know, for example, if that kind of thing would have to happen to this vehicle. If I would have to lose it in that way because of my relationship with these students, or what would happen to their vehicles as they relate to you if you continue in the direction that you're going and they continue in the direction of possibly serving as older member or teacher as they relate to you. This requires that you travel fast, doesn't it? We don't know what's on the books, and we don't guess it. We are not, as we have said before, we are not into any martyr trip. We don't like that. It's unnatural. It should not be. It was not designed for anyone to like martyrdom or to think that they got spiritual elevation by it, which could be a mistranslation or counterfeit information of what happened at a death which paid a debt, and then therefore freed the one who paid it and went on up. And it's true, as people say, Jesus didn't owe that debt. It wasn't his. Those sins weren't his, even though at one time he had gone through that same process that they were going through long time ago. Because that's the way, don't forget, that children get into our Father's kingdom. And certainly Jesus was one who got into our Father's kingdom. Now, exactly what the lesson plans were and the particulars about graduation at the time that Jesus graduated into our Father's kingdom from a human kingdom or a human kingdom equivalent, we don't know that because we don't have that information available to us. The possibility exists, theoretically, if not realistically. Don't forget that we've also talked about how every individual on this planet in this age could have been a created individual instead of one born of sin. I'm afraid that's true. That is sin. That is a condition that was brought to them from a kingdom below. It was an animal condition. It was not intended for human, even though human was designed to have the capability of doing that act, and they have the option to do it. But they have to look away from their relationship of the one assigned to them by the kingdom of heaven in order to participate in that act. Now, the reason I'm bringing that back up is because Jesus could have graduated in a class or from an age where that didn't happen. Whether that's only theoretical and did or did not take place is unimportant. The fact is that the kingdom of man, the kingdom of human, is designed to go both ways. And by choice, in this age that we know from our history books primarily being the one history book that most of the public questions the most as to whether or not it's an authentic history book. The one that does actually tell about God's, our Heavenly Father's, our Creator's relationship with man is the one that the deceived question the most as to whether or not it is an authentic record or if it is some spiritual documents or legends. And yet it is the only record that of events. I'm not saying that there's a lot in there that you could quibble over whether or not this little, for example, punctuation that means a lot in your understanding of things. And yet, for the most part, the biblical scriptures had no punctuation. So you didn't know where sentences ended and the next one began, and it could have a lot of different meanings. So how much of it that man, because of misinformation, since that's where Satan camped the most to give information from those who were the rightful heirs of our Father's kingdom, gets pretty sticky, doesn't it? Okay, we might have gone enough on that course to have you understand that, but it is so important to understand that our Father's kingdom is alive and well. There is still a group, or there are still individuals that serve in the capacity of court, making decisions about what to do about this case. Sin still adds up and can add up to such a great total that there's not enough of our Father's mind left in there to account for anything. It's impossible for it to be salvaged. And therefore, even at that point, then it becomes a positive because it is recycled. No child of God is lost. And make no doubt about that. But it's our Father's kingdom has the right to do that, to recycle what has become so poor. I mean, that's what's going to happen. Now, I don't want to sound like the prophet, but here at the end of the age, this is what becomes such an important issue, is because things get very critical at the end of the age. And I know I'm going to throw my teleprompters here off by skipping to that for a moment, but you know, humans could say, well, this all sounds good and well, but I don't see any evidence. And I could go to the history books and I can't see that this is really. No, because there are no manuscripts of what happened specifically at the end of the last age. Therefore, great swarms of members of our Father's kingdom, plus from the counterfeit kingdom, could come in at the end of the age and take their part of the harvest of whatever was, in a sense, matched with them because of what the soul had become at that point. And Lucy's kingdom wants souls. He wants them more than our Father's kingdom. That's kind of hard to understand. Because Lucy's kingdom needs them. I mean, he needs them desperately as he works against our Father's kingdom. Our Father's kingdom wants them because they are his creation, that he wants to be able to have them receive the inheritance of sonship in his kingdom. But believe it or not, our Father's kingdom does not need those souls. Our Father's kingdom can get along fine without them. He's not out recruiting them because he needs them for an army to work against Satan. Nope. Different altogether. Our Father's kingdom does not need them. Our Father's kingdom is all sufficient. All for our sake. All involved in being a benefactor. All involved in trying to help those with potential receive their potential. Not concerned with building an army. I mean, it's certainly true that our Father is so pleased and excited, and nothing could make him happier than to have graduates into his kingdom, new children, new grandchildren, new great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren, if you talk in a relationship to the Creator. And it's important that we understand that. Check what's next on our list.
Well, would you like to talk about the domesticated animal's relationship to human, and is that a usable parallel?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that we should discuss that, and this is going to test some others, because we'll have to use terminology that you might have been taught by certain traditional backgrounds to be turned off about. And we have discussed this slightly, and this, I'm afraid we can't discuss this without also discussing the appropriate usage of terms like creation and evolution. And I'm not talking in terms of Darwinianism. But just because Darwin existed doesn't mean that things don't evolve, and we are prohibited from using the term evolving, or thereby using it as evolution. Our Father's kingdom has designed a lot of things within the framework of his creation that evolves. And yet, where he does not want things to evolve, he takes out a link in the chain so that it can't evolve beyond that. I mean, there'll be a missing link so that there's no evolvement beyond that. Or he might permit certain things to evolve and others not to evolve, or vehicles not to evolve, but some souls to evolve. So so in that usage, again I say not in the typical Darwin usage. In that usage, the design of creation is also involves evolving, which is beautiful if you think of it in the right way. I mean, as you look at the various degrees of souls that you might be acquainted with on this planet, as to their various stages of growth, you see things evolving away from the truth, away from our Heavenly Father. You see them evolving closer. You see that happening in whether it be religious groups or families or nations or anything. You see them evolving or getting more corruptible, more perishable, or less corruptible, less perishable, and that's what it is. Back to Czech's question. Let's talk about the illustration of a domesticated animal in its relationship to the human kingdom, and use it as a illustration or a parallel of a human that's trying to get into the heavens or into our Father's kingdom. When a domesticated animal doesn't like to act like an animal, doesn't even identify with being an animal, it only cares to please its master, which is the case in different nations with different animals. For the most part, in this nation, or in the U.S., it's the dog, or in some instances the cat. The thing that identifies, that we'll use as our analogy here, is when all that little animal wants is to please, and it just runs around wanting an indication of, am I pleasing, and just waiting for one moment of attention from that human. And it doesn't like to run with dogs. If it has truly evolved, it doesn't. And I have to bring up another issue here that might touch your funny bone in one way or the other. I can remember hearing some animal rights people who are concerned with the overpopulation of animals in the world, and they talk about this: have your pet spayed or neutered. And that's one of the kindest things that could happen to that dog or that pet, because then that gives added help to that little pet to be more preoccupied with service, more preoccupied with pleasing, more preoccupied with what can I do. Now, a lot of times that's where it kind of separates, where certain dogs who want to be petted, and that's about as far as their service gets. And there are others whose service can extend beyond to that, and they yield very quickly or easily for a training that can even find them as seeing eye dogs or hearing dogs, or where they're trained to do a lot of tasks. And I think this happens certainly in some countries with development in the monkeys or the chimpanzees, and I don't know what all other type of domesticated animals that are trying to please the human kingdom. Well, unfortunately, the same ratio happens, that the more difficult the transition is to pleasing, or the more requirement it is, in other words, the stiffer the task is of trying to assist in real service to the human kingdom, the more it weeds out a lot of the dogs or whatever the domesticated animal might be that really shows a conscious desire for approval and to serve. It's the same way as a human is trying to overcome his humanness and not associate with humans, and wants only to be a member of our Father's kingdom, and would even crave to be spayed and neutered, and we're not certainly permitted to do that kind of thing because of the position of jeopardy that it would put us in. Remembering that in generations past, that even some of those Essene communities that we talked about, and they did do neutering of their sexuality in order to get closer to their Heavenly Father. And Jesus certainly knew of that when he gave the little illustration of some become eunuchs because, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, some become eunuchs because others have made them eunuchs, some make themselves eunuchs in order to serve the kingdom of heaven. So if you read that carefully within its context, you see how that exists. There's a very strong parallel. Now, at this point, we have to switch into another gear as we talk about this domesticated relationship of the animal to the human, or the human to our Father's kingdom. And we have to talk more in terms of soul than a vehicle. Because if you just understand that the most likely scenario, or the most likely, I'm not saying this is true, and we don't teach it as truth. We have examined it because it was given to us to examine, and it seems likely, and we certainly wouldn't be disturbed if that's the way it happens. But that the soul of a domesticated animal that wanted only to please and was willing to go to X step, that at some point they received their reward and got to move in as beginners in the human kingdom. And we don't know what all the rules were as to who got to move into the human kingdom and who got to move, what souls got to move into the human kingdom. At that point, then really this thing that we call soul and identify as a package for mind that comes from two sources, even the rightful application of the word soul comes into existence at the first time. Needless to say, the dog wasn't able to talk to his neighbor dog about his soul. That wasn't in his vocabulary. Only upon reaching into the human kingdom does even that word processor become a part of his potential and to his brain and his understanding. So in that sense of the word, then soul began in the human kingdom. Though there was still something that could have certainly come from that devoted creature, that life force that wanted to move up, that wanted not to be like the other creatures in its kingdom, but wanted to associate with that kingdom. And it helps you get this picture if you can accept that illustration. Whether the illustration is that accurate or not is relatively unimportant, though it seems likely that it might be. Okay, I was going to go to a later question, but I think for the moment, we'll stick to our pattern here. Was that Czech's question? Okay, Song, what's next on your list?
I wondered if you wanted to go back to the topic we were discussing at the end of the last tape on possessions and indebtedness and charge cards, and perhaps not leaving a mess behind.
Well, we have to, because we just barely got started on that, and that's such an important issue. I'm trying to recall, since we have made session 6 and 7, wasn't it, or 7 and 8? 7 and 8? Mm-hmm. We've made 7 and 8 twice, and it's hard to be clear as to how much was made. And, I've got to stop here and remind you that that makes it hard for me. Okay, we've talked about how lessons are hard for us. And the reason they're hard for us is because it drives it home. And the lesson that I learned that caused us to have to do that has side issues like the one I'm speaking of now. It makes it hard for me to remember. And being hard for me to remember helps me not forget that lesson if I apply it in that way. Okay, to go back to the topic. And it'll be funny if just about the time we get back to the topic we see the little card. Haven't seen it yet. Okay, here we go. And if you know your religious manuscripts, if you know the Judeo-Christian literature, you know that a number of times in that material it speaks of the value of man's relationship to possessions and money and indebtedness. And if someone borrows something from you, that you if they need to borrow it from you, that if you have it, then and they need it and it's valuable to them from our Father's point of view, then you give it, and if they pay it back, fine. If they don't, you forget about it. Needless to say, that's not the way it is in this world. And that's not really nearly as important an issue as the issue that has gotten so totally out of sync with our Father's kingdom, and that is indebtedness. The human world out there today, everyone owes for everything, and that is totally contrary to our Father's kingdom. According to our Father's kingdom, you should not have use of anything that did not come your way rightfully. It is improper to go out and borrow money, then get something and put it into use, and then you owe for it, and frequently, by the time you've paid for it, it's worthless. So then what do? You borrow more money and buy insurance policies to cover what it was that you didn't have use of, so that you would have a guarantee that you might be able to have use of something you had no right to have use for. Well, I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can with this issue. The principle that we have to live by is that we are not permitted to have any indebtedness. And we can see the value of that what is given to us is adequate. If it is not given to us, then we have no business using it. If we ask for it and do not receive it, we go and re-examine our asking and discover that it was improper asking. It was inappropriate asking. And the same thing goes for credit cards. How can we owe the petroleum company for gasoline that we're using in our automobile when it isn't paid for? It isn't ours. And we might not ever have the ability to pay for it. And of course, well, then Satan has another little thing that you can come in real neat. You can just get it all relieved by just chapter 11, to get a fresh start. And yet, it really isn't a fresh start. It's in a sense, it's held against you. But the principle of our Father's kingdom says that what I give to you, I give to you. It is yours. He does not give us anything that we owe him for. When we do things, we talked about the only kind of indebtedness that he knows anything about, and that is when we go against him, then we are creating an indebtedness against him that is hard to pay for step by step, of course, unless relieved. But credit cards, therefore, are taboo unless you can have one because it might help open a door for you and you don't use it. That might be an okay thing. Now, even that means automobiles. Yes, it means houses. It means everything. And we've got to cover this issue more because there's that sign that 10 seconds just went up. And we'll start here next time and see how far we can go.